coming after this deep intellectual French discussion, I'm going to be coming with my cellophane behavioristic American analysis of minorities. I mean, it really, it's almost shameful to come after that, but I'll try making a few intelligent points. Basically, I want to make a claim that one of the major questions in the Israeli political scene has been since 1976, Land Day, in which 6 Israeli Arabs were killed. They were killed over the space of 36 hours. Certainly today, with much better policing, it was still an age where Israel was very much threatened on the interstate level, so very few resources were expended on good policing. Today, those kind of demonstrations wouldn't have produced any lethalities. But since then, one of the crucial questions on the Israeli political scene, and there are so many questions, but this is one of them, is whether the Israeli Arab minority, or Israel's Arab citizens, are working within the system, or are they moving, or they could be basically becoming very, very oppositional, very violent towards the state. And I want to make 2 claims in the following presentation. One is that there's growing accumulated evidence that this question has been resolved. Israel's Arab citizens are within the system, committed to the system, to the state, and if they use violence, they use it sparingly, and certainly strategically. And the second claim that I want to say is that the relationship between the Israeli state and its minority is a very extreme case, and the success in handling that relationship from both sides, or maybe from 3 sides, from the side of the state, from the side of the predominant majority, and from the behavior of the Arabs themselves, basically gives tremendous hope and optimism to world society that vibrant democracies, even in the most hostile environments, basically can sort out majority-minority problems in a more or less peaceful manner. And that even when there are demands for devolution, it will probably be worked out peacefully. So this is an extreme case that teaches about many, or most other cases under less adverse circumstances. Basically, I asked this, the typical answer to this question, are Israeli Arabs working within the system, or are they gravitating towards a very confrontational, oppositional approach, is based on a the basic frame is based on a very primitive theory, a theory of frustration, aggression. Almost anything you read about Israeli Arabs usually is set within that frame, that nothing is being done for the Israeli Arabs, and just frustration is growing and growing and growing, and it's just going to explode in our face. And I would like to suggest that that's not only a primitive, maybe even racist reading or discriminatory reading. I would like to suggest that both the state and the minority think strategically thinking strategically leads to more often win-win situations than lose-lose or even win-lose outcomes. I said that there's accumulated evidence to support my claim. One of them is the commemoration of Land Day. For the first 20 years after Land Day, you always had reports in the newspapers, and I've really looked at this, that anticipated violence. And at around 20 years after this Land Day, after the peacefulness of Land Day commemorations, this sort of petered out. But then, of course, there was the most violent episode ever in the history between the state and Israel's Arab minority. It was on Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of the Intifada. For the first time, Israeli Arabs became violent just at the moment that the Israeli state was being attacked from an outside force. And I'll consider the Palestinians or the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Gaza, from the Israeli perspective, as an external hostile force. So this seemed to be the nadir, the low point. Nothing could be worse. Even more worrisome to both the Israeli establishment and to the Israeli Jewish majority were some of the themes that were expressed during these very, very violent demonstrations. I wasn't there to witness it. I was in Shul. I was in Bet Knesset in Rosh Hashanah. So I just went to the Israeli Arab newspapers like As-Sinara and the Organ in 2000, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, which was basically initiated by the Israeli, almost initiated by the Israeli Arabs. And when I read, and also the newspaper of the Islamic movement, the Northern Branch, Sawt al-Haq wal Hurriyah, I learned that the major slogan was Khaybar Khaybar Ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad Sayaud. Khaybar Khaybar, the famous victory of the Muslims over the Jewish tribes. Know that the army of Muhammad is coming back. Basically, a message that couldn't be more confrontational, oppositional to any meaning of Jewish democratic statehood. So the expectations of commentators, political analysts, is that we were treading on a road of no return between a minority that during the mandate fought the Jews tooth and nail, and therefore I wanted to look at what patterns did emerge after this major, unique occasion of violence, both in context and in the messages that they were emitting, and in the internal context of violence. So what I did basically was to look at mobilization patterns in 2 days of commemoration in the first decade after the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And before I did so, I wanted to test this proposition of frustration and aggression. And I noticed that beforehand, there was plenty to be frustrated about. Wait, I'll try getting it. There was plenty to get frustrated about. Going back to that model said that if there's increased frustration, there's increased aggression. And therefore, there were many moves, which would have predicted, had this model been right, even greater violence, greater opposition, a greater exiting from the Israeli system. This was a time of the 2002 onslaught on Judea and Samaria. Basically, we entered the areas A of the Palestinian Authority. It was a time of the first offensive against Gaza in 2009. It was a period of intensive legislation, most of it annulled by the Higher Court of Justice, that tried to basically tie down the members of to repress the members of the Arab members of Knesset. So there was plenty of grievances, which could lead to frustration and ultimately aggression. So how did it work out in the two major commemoration events that mark the calendar of Israeli Arab civil society? So there are two commemoration events. One is the Land Day commemoration event, which is organized by the Israeli Communist Party, or which is basically, until this day, at least theoretically, a Jewish Arab party, so it's much more moderate. And the second day of commemoration came into being after the October Intifada, and that was organized by Balad, which is basically an Israeli Arab party that is ideologically linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Their ideology is very anti-state. So you would think, were that theory correct, and were you to think that the Israeli Arabs are exiting from the system, that there would be violence around these commemoration dates, and that you would think that the October commemoration date would be commemorated in greater numbers than the Land Day commemoration, which was organized by the more moderate Israeli Communist Party. And what we see, basically, this is the commemoration. This is the commemoration of the October, the more radical event. That indeed, in the first year, I have a very loud voice. In the first year, indeed, there was tremendous participation, and it was violent. But it tailed off in a very radical way in subsequent years. In fact, it's so reduced in proportions that it was that basically participation, which became peaceful in both commemorations, basically the more moderate commemoration became much larger and much more politically salient and important. So the commemoration of Land Day, which is a commemoration of a minority working within the system, really overrode the October commemoration, which in the first years of that commemoration was billed as the beginning of the exiting of the Israeli Arab minority from from accepting the state. So basically, and just for a few visuals, just to show how meager mobilization became during these two commemoration events, we can just look at it even from the photographs. Close-ups, of course, you know, we all know from promotional material of all kinds of organizations that the smaller the audience, the greater the close-up. So that's exactly what happens here. You also notice an aging and a graying of the participants, which is interesting in itself. And finally, we've had a more recent test. Finally, we've had a more recent test in the outlawing. Israel just outlawed the northern branch of the Islamic movement, which is certainly the most extreme political organization, legal or formerly legal organization in Israel, and there was no ripple effect to speak of. So I hope that I have sort of amassed sufficient material to demonstrate that the Israeli Arabs are working within the system, and given the fact that we, to take my cue from Max Singer, that we live in a zone of war and turmoil compared to the European zone of peace, that Israel is an extreme case, and the fact that basically the relationship between the Israeli state and Israel's Arab population is manageable, points to great optimism for the vibrancy of democracies in dealing with minority problems, as much as ideationally you have extreme differences between the majority and the minority. Thank you very much.